On March 17, Russia will host the main day of voting in the presidential elections of Russia. Opinion polls show that there are no equals to the current head of state. Political scientists conclude that none of the candidates has a chance to defeat Vladimir Putin. And what Vladimir Putin has done for the people of Russia. Recently, the policy of suppressing opponents of Vladimir Putin as president, who is regularly elected in this country, has been tightening. At a minimum, censorship is applied to his opponents. His supporters have already taken up all-round defense and say in plain text that they will strangle anyone who says a word against. And this is done when people only express their thoughts, doubts, and dissatisfaction with the current president. He did a lot to make society revolt in the end. At the beginning of the last term of government, he zeroed out, increased his term in the chair of the head of state by 2 years. During this time, the constitution was rewritten, the guarantor of which was the president, and significantly diminished its importance in the life of society, making the basic law insignificant compared to its decrees. He forced the State Duma to create laws that infringe on the lives of citizens. He closed all the social elevators. He carried out for anti-people reforms that significantly worsened the life of the entire Russian society. He closed the internet sources on which the population successfully earned money. He took business and entrepreneurship under strict control. He forced the chronically unemployed population to survive on casual earnings and at the same time pay taxes to the state, imposing the status of the self-employed. He strengthened the state's control over citizens and their incomes. He destroyed science, production, and economy, provoked an increase in aggression against Russia from most countries. He drove society into a long-term depression, which affected demography. He made the main part of society poor, violated a number of citizens' freedoms granted to them by the Constitution, returned the censorship. He introduced the concept of a foreign agent, turning some dissidents into outcasts. He began repressions against people who disagree with his policies. He spent huge amounts of money and resources to support other countries, fleecing Russians. Spends the state treasury, guided by personal tasks. It spends billions of rubles on the maintenance of the supreme power in the country. The income gap between the poor and the rich is huge. Destroyed the middle class. Allowed employers to ignore labor laws. He taught the country to litigate, resolving all issues only through the courts with a very problematic judicial system and imperfect laws. Even Rosstat cannot hide the fact that the Russian population is dying out now. The causes can be divided into 3 interrelated causes. The first is economic. Beggarly earnings do not allow you to simply feed a large family. Even one child brings such financial problems that children are born later and no more than one. Only official propaganda did not say that 75% of the population in this country are actually poor or destitute, which considers people with an income of 17,000 rubles to be the middle class, which is about $190. But the lack of prospects is much scarier than low earnings. People are not idiots and perfectly see the economic situation in the country. Most people without any economic education understand that the prospects for improving their financial situation are very illusory. And it doesn't matter if you have an education or not. Incomes sufficient to support a family with 3 children will not be sufficient in the foreseeable future. This applies primarily to men, because with a large number of children, a woman is no longer up to making money. Many people will now begin to slip examples from their personal lives and stamps like, who doesn't want doesn't earn. To be honest, such people are bored to death with their stupidity and selfishness. If everything is fine for you personally and in your immediate environment, this does not mean that the whole country lives like this. And from entrepreneurs who tell stories about the fact that they are willing to pay a lot and talk about the lazy population. Yes, no one in the world works hard like Russians. If you have high earnings in Russia, this means the most severe exploitation, which is even physically impossible to withstand, for a long time anyway. And the requirements for competence will be such that only a person who has studied for a very long time can know this, and it is for this vacancy, because the requirements are unique everywhere. So it turns out that the young lack competencies, and the elderly lack health. But it's not even a problem with food that's much scarier. The most terrible of the economic problems is the problem with housing. Don't be fooled by new buildings growing like mushrooms. No more than 20% of the population can afford an apartment even on a mortgage. So apartments are actually purchased there not for personal residence, but for investment purposes. There is a very small rural population in Russia now. In rural areas, it is much easier to feed a family, thanks to the availability of land and your own farm. Although the village has its own problems. Kindergartens there are just a dream, schools are constantly closed. It is often necessary to travel tens of kilometers to the pediatrician. So if it's easier to feed them, then everything else is a problem. Therefore, young people flee from the village to the big cities. The second reason is psychological. For many years, the population has been hammered into the head that stupid and irresponsible people have a lot of children. There is no need to breed poverty. Each of us has heard this phrase many times, and many have said it. There is another extreme, the education of selfishness. Why bind yourself? You need to live for yourself. And so it goes year after year. And then the health is not the same and the desire has finally disappeared. Also, the breakup of the family. Left alone, a woman no longer gives birth, remaining with one child. But the birth rate depends primarily on the number of births per woman. My pride in my profession has been completely killed. It started back in the Soviet Union. So now working as a tractor driver or milkmaid is, to put it mildly, not welcome among the young. From here, let's move on to another reason. This is consumerism. Consumers have been brought up from the younger generation for years. It also began in the Soviet Union. But the propaganda of consumerism as the main value in life has reached its apogee now. Young people are persistently drummed into their heads that the most important thing in life is money and everything that can be bought with it. And how you got them doesn't matter. Hence, there is simply a monstrous decline in morals when they earn money by prostitution, or even something heavier. It is easy to access the panel. The main thing is money. Who with such attitudes will have children? Unless it's just by accident. Finally, it is simply chronic stress, which generates both additional psychological problems and purely medical ones, especially in the male part of the population. The ability to have these very children is trite. And the third reason is healthcare. Medical care is practically inaccessible to the majority of the population. They can still write out a certificate and prescribe something for a cold, but something more serious is already a problem. The queue for neuro specialists stretches for months, and in small towns, not to mention the countryside, they are simply inaccessible. This affects both a decrease in the birth rate for purely medical reasons and mortality. A separate topic is the wild high cost of medicines and any treatment. The elderly have to choose whether to pay for pills or for utilities. However, the situation is no better for workers. They are treated only as a last resort, but they go and get sick, because if you get seriously ill, you will be thrown out of work. And everything is so expensive that you also have to choose between utilities and pills. In this situation, you can simply forget about sanatoriums. Free medicine has been completely killed, and paid medicine is either unavailable, or is generally a profanation, a pump for pumping funds out of a person. It is not profitable for doctors to cure a patient. It is beneficial for them that he is ill longer and heavier. And don't talk about competition here, where it's the same everywhere. The competition among all these types of doctors is only in the ability to spin a sucker. Such inaccessibility, coupled with poor quality, results in high mortality. So in addition to the low birth rate, the population is also affected by high mortality. And not only among the elderly, the young also die at least as often. If you do not believe, go to the cemetery and read the dates of life on the tablets. What good has Putin done for Russians? He showed himself as a man trying to strengthen the state by subjugating society. All these talks that he increased the budget of Russia by 22 times are being questioned, because public sector employees both receive their $200 to $300 a month, and they receive it. The fact that GDP has grown 12 times and Russia has jumped from 36th place in the world in terms of GDP to 6th place. This has not greatly affected the well-being of Deep Russia and the people living there. He returned 256 mineral deposits to Russian jurisdiction, but the profit from them went to the accounts of Western banks and settled there like a dead weight. Under Putin, the state took away all the mechanisms of making money from the population. Even grandmothers with seeds, berries and greens are a thing of the past. The most desperate faces rarely flash by. It is now possible to earn an extra penny only for those whose incomes the state can control. Now the impoverished population is sitting at home, rejoicing at the possibility of slave labor for pennies, for the uncle of an entrepreneur, a bloodsucker who is under the protection of the state. In real Russia, honest work has ceased to be a value. You can work for days at a time, but still remain poor. Everything that the current president has not done in his post has not brought benefits to the country. Although he did a lot, he did it on a point-by-point and small scale. The state should exist for people, not people for the state, because the state is people. It must be understood that the government is removable, temporary. The society is looking for citizens who are positively minded to create within themselves and nominates them as leaders of the country. And when the authorities pursue a policy with signs of extremism, and then arrange a hunt for citizens who expose it, this is not right. It is clear that Putin has supporters. They will certainly vote for it. But there are many others who live on random pennies. And there is nothing to shut their mouths when they exercise their right to a personal opinion. Censorship in Russia is prohibited by the constitution. What's left to do then? The answer to this question follows from the answer to the question who is to blame. And the country's leadership is to blame for this. More precisely, the system in which Russians live and which was created by real helmsmen. These steersmen are a large oligarchic business and government structures that have grown together with it. And the only thing that can save the people from extinction and the country from disappearing from the world map is the removal of the world eaters from power and from governing the country, its economy and politics.